Isn't it lovely to wake up to some sunshine? Oh my gosh, everything feels so much easier when it's sunny, doesn't it? Is that just me? No, I don't think it is. So we are on week 2 of our looking at our relational well-being. Last week, Mark kicked us off. If you can swap us over, Pedro, that'd be great. Mark kicked us off looking at connections. If you remember who was here last week, Peggy, did you sort out a new mobile phone? Get a new network? Did you sort that out? Poor Peggy. We were thinking about our connections, and Mark talked about true connections, superficial connections, costly connections, and no connection. And he encouraged us to be present, to be real, and to build up and bless. And in an ideal world, in an ideal community, this is how we would operate all of the time, wouldn't we? But, much as I love you and much as you are wonderful, this is not an ideal world or an ideal community. And that's not to say it's bad. Of course it isn't. You are wonderful and you are beautiful, and it is an extraordinary community. But it is made up of humans. And humans, don't we know, have the propensity to hurt one another. Yes? Let's name it. So today we're going to think about those times outside of the church, but also, sadly, sometimes within the church, when our connections become costly. And when, rather than building up and blessing, we tear down and hurt. We're going to think about forgiveness and about reconciliation. We're going to think about how they differ and how we respond to God's call on us to forgive and to be a part of God's ministry of reconciliation. Because whether you've been around the block for a long time or whether you've just come to faith, you'll know that forgiveness and reconciliation are the heart of the gospel. They are what Jesus came to do. It is what God does in us every single day, and it is what we are called to do. But I think it's probably one of the hardest things that we have to do as well. For many of us, it doesn't come naturally, this call to forgive. And there is a reason for that. It's because we are built, we are created, we are formed to defend ourselves. Now, once upon a time, a long time ago, that would have been for our literal physical survival, perhaps against a ravenous lion or a ravenous tribe, who knows, which is why it can be so hard to take the steps to forgive. We are built to defend ourselves. Something in us needs protecting. Nowadays, we don't really encounter ravenous lions, at least not in Hazlemere, and not ravenous tribes either, unless you're at a football match, I don't know, maybe. But it's more often about the survival, the protection of our sense of pride and what we believe we deserve. It's my right to protect myself. Whether we're the one who have done the hurting or we're the one who has been hurt, we are all, depending on all kinds of things, more or less defensive. And I put my hand up, the first among you, to say, I am extremely defensive. I don't take criticism well. I don't like conflict. I disagree with difficulty. I get very defensive. That means, of course, that I'm easily hurt. And therefore, I have a lot of forgiving to do all the time, even when really people have done nothing wrong. But it takes a lot to forgive, and it takes a lot to be forgiven. And Jesus' most famous words on this are going to help us to think about this concept. I think you'll remember probably Matthew chapter 18, these words as we come to them. If you've got a Bible, you might want to open it. I don't know if we've got somebody from Ops or Welcome who could hand some around. We're just going to have a look very briefly at Matthew chapter 18. And it doesn't matter if you don't have a Bible in front of you. You'll be able to follow along anyway. You'll just have to concentrate. You'll just have to concentrate. So in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 18, Jesus has been teaching the disciples about what to do when brothers and sisters in the community of faith hurt one another. Peter then comes up to Jesus and says, okay, Jesus, I get that we have to forgive one another, and I'm happy to hand out a get-out-of-jail-free card maybe once or twice. But I also understand that you are calling us to something completely different. You want us to be extra compassionate, extra forgiving. So I tell you what, how about 7 times? Now, he thinks he's being very benevolent. Look at me. I'm going to be able to forgive people 7 times. Jesus, though, as Jesus always does, turns that on its head and says, no, actually, Peter, 77 times. Now, is this a kind of tick the boxes? Or 75, 76 times. Okay, now I've forgiven him 77 times. I'm done. Don't need to forgive him anymore. Of course it's not. Of course it's not that. And there's a little bit of extraordinary Bible geekery, which you know I love, which is going to help us to understand this 77 times and where it comes from. And I'm with thanks to the Bible Project for this, because it's an amazing insight. There's only 2 places in the Bible where the numbers 7 and 77 are placed close together like this. This is one of them, Matthew chapter 18. Does anybody know where the other one is? It's obscure. I'd be super impressed if you do. It is in Genesis. If you've got a Bible or open in front of you or on your phone, you can flick with me to Genesis. Genesis chapter 4, in fact, right back at the beginning of the story of God's people. And it's a story about 2 brothers. You'll remember them, probably. Anybody know the 2 brothers who had a falling out? Cain and Abel, that's right. So one of the brothers, Cain, is jealous of the other brother, Abel. His pride has been wounded, and he's angry. That little creature inside him that he's trying to protect has reared its head, and those feelings of revenge, of anger, are coming up. And God tells him, don't let that anger overcome you. You've got to be in control of that. I understand you're protecting something, but you've got to be in control of your anger, and don't let your anger control you. But he doesn't listen to God, he doesn't control it, and what does he do? He goes out and he kills his brother. Now Cain goes on to build a city, and some generations later, one of his descendants is a guy called Lamech, and we encounter him here in the end of chapter 4. Now Lamech, very much like Cain, can't get his pride under control. And he recites this little poem. He's bragging to his wives about an encounter he's had. And here at the end of chapter 4, in verse 23, it says this: Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, check me out. I'm so manly. Listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. He says, I didn't just get vengeance 7 times like Cain did. I got vengeance 77 times. He's had this encounter with a young man who basically has tried to pick a fight with him, and Lamech's just murdered him there on the spot. I got 77 times vengeance, he tells his wives. And this is the story that Jesus alludes to when he's teaching about forgiveness. When Jesus turns the story about 77 times revenge on its head, when he talks instead about 77 times forgiveness, it's because he knows that forgiveness does not come naturally to us. Just for a moment, I want you to think of one time. There's got to be at least one. Even the most righteous and virtuous people here, there's got to be at least one time when your pride has been hurt, when somebody's done something to you, and those feelings of wanting to retaliate just kind of spontaneously come up. Anyone? Yes, thank you. I'm not on my own. I'm pretty sure that that's a really common thing for many of us. But that, of course, is the beginning of the spiral of revenge and conflict that we see around us every single day. It breaks family relationships. It breaks communities. It breaks countries. Any social media users here? Anyone on X, Twitter, whatever we're calling it, I don't know, Facebook? That kind of conflict, revenge, happens all the time. It's part of our society. It's part of our everyday experience for many of us. And so Jesus knows this is our natural instinct, but calls us yet to something completely different. Because he goes on in Matthew 18 to tell a parable about what life is like in the kingdom that we are all a part of now, that we live in now as Christians, that kingdom that Jesus inaugurated when he came to live among us, and us living on earth here as church, this parable about unending forgiveness. Jesus calls us then to live this kingdom way, not the world way. And in terms of conflict and revenge, Jesus says the kingdom way is one of unending forgiveness. Now, it's our call as individuals to forgive one another, yes, absolutely. But even more than that, it's a sign of a new humanity. The prophets, all the way through the history of God's people, were calling God's people to be different from everybody else, to be a different kind of human. And Jesus, again, came to show and teach us, because they just didn't get it. They kept not getting it over and over again. So Jesus came to show and teach us, to live among us, and to show us these signs of a new humanity. And the first of those is forgiveness. One of our jobs, then, as the church, is to declare to the world and to the unseen forces that shape and misshape it that it is possible to forgive and reconcile. It is possible to live in harmony across the barriers and divides that we put up, but only because of the life, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus Christ. So when we're talking about forgiveness for the person who criticized my sermon and hurt my pride, you are allowed to do that, by the way. I will forgive you. For the person who insulted me or put me down, for the one who triggered that reaction of hostility in me when they disagreed, even for the one who intentionally caused me harm, either physically or emotionally, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, we have to talk about the incarnation and the cross. The Croatian theologian Miroslav Volf, which, if you're interested, is an absolutely extraordinary writer and with a particular interest in forgiveness and reconciliation. I encourage you to go and read some of his stuff. He said this: "Whatever the reasons, when forgiveness happens, it is always a miracle of grace. The obstacles in its way are immense." What God has done for this world, the miracle of grace, of forgiveness, is the key to our own acts of forgiveness. And Jesus, God incarnate, inaugurates that process. By becoming human, by suffering and dying, the teachings, the life, the actual body of Jesus go into the wound of every divide, of every hurt, of every transgression, our own and those that are committed against us. Jesus' body goes into each one of those. The crucifixion reconciles the breach between God and humanity, and the resurrection transforms that wound and brings life out of death, brings life out of pain. That's the new humanity that our acts of forgiveness point to. That first forgiveness between God and humans. So there's a really helpful little picture here, and hopefully it comes up a bit better here than it did at CGS because it's a bit brighter. You can see the blue here. So the cross upon which Jesus died is said to operate both vertically and horizontally. Vertically, you can see there with my little pointer. There it is. As God works to restore humankind to communion with God. And then horizontally, why not? In order to bring about healing in human relations, either between individuals or groups. But the vertical has to happen first, because it's against our nature, right? It's against our nature. It's that communion with God that makes us human beings ultimately able to restore communion with one another. Jesus knows it's against our nature, 77 times against our nature, and so that first breach is to teach us how to forgive. Overcoming that first breach helps us to restore communion with everyone else. In a moment, we're going to think a little bit about the differences between forgiveness and reconciliation. But before that, an invitation to reflect just for a moment. Before Jesus died, what did we do? Before the spilling of blood, before the sacrifice of body, before the surrender of his life, what did we do? Nothing. We did nothing. This is how God demonstrates his own love for us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We did nothing. The initiative and the power for forgiveness comes only from God through Christ, a miracle of grace, remember, where God engages in restoration and forgiveness despite our sin. Are you waiting for someone to merit your forgiveness? Are you waiting for them to say the right words or do the right things before you offer them your forgiveness? If so, then you've got that wrong. There's a big difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. And because sometimes we misunderstand the difference, it stops us from forgiving. Because reconciliation might not always be possible for lots of different reasons, but forgiveness is always possible and is always our call as Christians. Forgiveness is an act of faith where one particular person, me, you, are taking our heavy bitterness and laying it at the feet of Jesus for him to be perfect judge over. Now, this act of trusting God can take place in the completely apart from the relationship of the person who's hurt you. It doesn't require anything of them. It's an inner, personal choice, a process of releasing anger and vengeance so that we avoid the deadly onset of bitterness and darkness. And it comes as a result of faith in Jesus Christ, in his death, in his resurrection, in that vertical work of the cross. We're going to move on in a minute to think about reconciliation. But before that, I want to say a little word about safety, first of all. Because sometimes, particularly in the church, we might think that it means we have to let people walk all over us, this unending forgiveness. Just take it, and one day Jesus will bring justice. And sometimes, in the church, it can be used to manipulate people. But we have to be honest and realistic about safety and about boundaries. And when the hurt is in the context of abuse, forgiveness cannot be used as a way to brush this under the carpet or to excuse the behavior of the abuser. How many people are there here this morning? I don't know, maybe there's about 100, 120 of us across the life of our church on a Sunday, all of our congregations combined. There's maybe, about 300 adults, maybe about 100 children and young people. Statistically, some of those people either are or have been in abusive relationships or in abusive situations. So we need to be really careful about how we deal with forgiveness and reconciliation. So forgiveness does not require staying in an unsafe situation. Forgiveness does not require accepting empty apologies or immediately trusting people who have hurt you. And forgiveness does not demand reconciliation. The hope is always that forgiveness would work towards it, but it is not dependent on it. And Dave does a really good job in the book of addressing this. He says it's important we are wise with who we are reconciled with, how and when we are reconciled with them. And if anybody needs any support with that, I'd really beseech you actually to speak to somebody wise and trusted so that you can do that well and be accompanied. So let's turn now to think a bit more about the differences between forgiveness and reconciliation. And I think there's two ways we can distinguish between them. The first one person can forgive, but it takes two to reconcile. Forgiveness, as I've said, is a personal act of faith with the help of God, of one person, of myself. It's a spiritual act, which means that ultimately I rely on God's grace to accomplish it, and it does not depend on any other person's behavior or permission. Reconciliation, on the other hand, requires the willingness of both. It needs both people to offer and ask for forgiveness. And sometimes it isn't appropriate to reconcile. I can forgive someone for damaging our friendship, but I may not feel safe enough to resume that friendship. Or I might forgive and be ready to reconcile, but the person no longer desires that relationship. Forgiveness and reconciliation are two separate things. Reconciliation requires the laying aside of those instincts that we talked about earlier to protect our pride, our sense of entitlement, our self-righteousness. And it also takes some time to lament. Sometimes we have to explore the painful feelings of the hurt before we are ever able to move on. And the theologian, Reverend Dr. Soong Chan Ra, writes this, that true reconciliation, justice, and shalom require a remembering of suffering, an unearthing of a shameful history, and a willingness to enter into lament. Lament calls for an authentic encounter with the truth and challenges privilege, because privilege would hide the truth and creates discomfort. Those feelings of retaliation, they're difficult to lay aside, aren't they? When our pride is hurt, it's really uncomfortable to go and ask for forgiveness sometimes. But perhaps it actually has more value when we're ready to enter into that discomfort, when we're ready to lament the things that we have done in order to go and seek forgiveness and reconciliation where possible. So that's the first distinction. The second is this. Forgiveness, as I've said, is an interior discipline. Reconciliation is an outward process. Forgiveness is an ongoing and private discipline, and one that is just one aspect of an overall posture towards one another, towards life. It requires that we look at other people with openness and compassion. It requires us to be slow to place blame and to resist seeking revenge. But reconciliation is not private because it must include at least one other person. The space for reconciliation only opens up when two people acknowledge and are able to discuss the nature of the wrong things that were done, and to be accountable, and to ask for forgiveness, and to make amends. Now, it's been a little while since we did some New Testament Greek, so I think it's probably about the right time. Do you think? Are you happy? Say yes, Claire. Yes, Claire. If we look at the Greek for the word reconciliation, we can see this kind of transactional aspect a little bit better. So the Greek for reconciliation is here. Let's have a look. Too far? Here it is. Katalasso. Can you say that? Katalasso. Excellent. Is anyone actually keeping a track of our Greek? No, probably not. Just me. Because you probably have a sentence by now, I reckon. A slightly odd one, but still. So katalasso, it means to decisively change, alter, transform, to exchange one way of being for another, especially in the context of returning to favor. And the root of this word, which is alasso, means to cause one thing to cease and another to take its place. Reconciliation, then, means people exchange enmity for friendship. Just as God, through the transformative work of Christ on the cross, exchanges our alienation for adoption. Now, I understand and I know that the journey towards this is not always easy. It requires humility, time, and patience. But Jesus reconciled us to God through the cross. And to close, we're going to look at these verses from 2 Corinthians. In fact, perhaps we could read them together. Let's have these together. Let's read together then. All of this is a gift from God, who brought us back to himself through Christ. And God has given us this task of reconciling people to him. For God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them, and he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. Jesus, the ultimate example of forgiveness, who from the cross as he was dying, asked God to forgive them, for they do not know what they do. We need to have that same kind of double vision that Jesus had. A way of putting ourselves into the shoes of the person that we have hurt, or even the person who has hurt us. Look at things from someone else's point of view. Stand in their shoes. Forgive them. That kind of double vision is only possible for us because of the work of Christ on the cross. How do we play our part in forgiveness and reconciliation? Well, first of all, we accept that we are forgiven. And as we come now to take communion, we remember all that Christ has done for us. In the taking of bread and the taking of wine, we remember that his body was given so that we might be forgiven. His blood was spilled so that we might be in communion with God. And what is the outpouring of that? What is the overflow, if you will? It is that we forgive one another, that we point our communities, our friendships, our families, our world to the new humanity, where harmony, where forgiveness, where reconciliation are a possibility in Jesus. So we are going to do just that now. I'd invite you in a moment of silence now to think maybe about those people that you know you have hurt, or maybe those people who have hurt you. And to bring that bitterness, that pain, to the feet of Jesus, who is perfect judge of all.